Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. As Jürgen already said, my name is Sanne Rovers. I started here as a PhD student in November 2015. I'm currently in my final year. My project has focused on improving self-regulated learning in medical students in the PBL curriculum. And since the conception of my original research proposal, a lot of things have changed, and we've had to be quite flexible in our studies. And in this presentation, I will give an overview of the studies that have been conducted so far. That does nothing. Okay. Oh. There we go. So, as a student in a problem-based learning curriculum, it can be hard to navigate through the learning process. You have to define appropriate learning goals, find the right literature, decide on the right breadth and depth of studying the sources, and use the literature to come up with a solution to the identified problem. This can be challenging and, quite frankly, a little overwhelming. Because how do you get from this to this? In order to navigate through this information jungle, students need to properly self-regulate their learning. Self-regulated learning has been defined in the literature as the process by which students activate and sustain cognitions, behaviors, and effects, which are systematically oriented towards the attainment of their goals. And in my research project, the overall research question has been, how can we support self-regulated learning for medical students in a PBL curriculum? Now, when trying to improve any constructs generally, but in this case self-regulated learning specifically, there are three important points. We have the end goal of where we want students to end up. We want to do that through interventions, and in order to find out whether the intervention had the desired effect, we need appropriate forms of measurement. In this project, we started with the first point, the end goal. And we wanted to ask ourselves, what does effective learning, effective self-regulated learning, look like in a PBL curriculum? So as an overall research question, we asked, how do effective self-regulating students in a PBL higher education curriculum approach their learning? And we tried to answer this question using a focus group study. We used a purposive sampling method in which we asked first-year mentors to identify students who they considered to be effective self-regulators. We asked 16 mentors who identified 42 students, and in the end, after approaching these students, we ended up with a sample size of 26. These students were divided over 4 focus groups, with a first meeting and then a second meeting 4 months later, in which we discussed preliminary results and tried to delve deeper into the results from the first meeting. And before the focus groups, we asked students to fill out a learning strategy questionnaire, which was designed by Hardwick and Donlowski, in which students are asked to rate their use of the 10 most common strategies on a 1.5 Likert scale. And we used the results of this questionnaire as a starting point for these focus groups. So instead of sticking to the numbers, we asked students how they use these strategies, why they use them, and in which situations they use them. So going to the results, I will first show you the results of the questionnaire. We have sorted the strategies from high use to low use, so with means starting from high to low. And when we look at the learning strategies with a mean of 3 and higher, which I use as a cutoff point now, we see quite a varied picture, with students using some strategies that are highly effective, such as self-testing, but also students reporting a number of questions which are traditionally viewed as ineffective, such as summarizing and underlining or marking. So, like I said, this was used as a starting point for the focus groups, and after the content analysis for the focus groups, we arrived at the following model, which, don't worry, I'll walk you through it. In this model, students are driven by a learning goal, which can be either quantitative or qualitative. And an example of a quantitative learning goal is a student who uses the amount of content studied as sort of a cutoff point. So this will be a student saying, I need a summary of at least 3 pages. Whereas a qualitative learning goal is a learning goal that is more focused on understanding, and a student wants to understand the content rather than focusing on specific numbers. Well, this drives their learning, which is characterized by a constant process of active processing of the subject matter while constantly monitoring their learning process. And at the same time, students maintain a balance between established study habits while at the same time maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changes in their learning environment. Throughout this process, students displayed varying degrees of metacognitive knowledge, for example, regarding how they developed the strategies that they were using and why they used them. And as I mentioned before when I showed you the table, what was interesting to see is that students reported a number of strategies that are traditionally treated as ineffective by most authors in the literature, such as rereading or highlighting, but they use them in a way to fit their learning process and fit their learning needs, for example, by using them in an active manner or by using them to cluster the knowledge. So we need to go from the use of learning strategy questionnaires to a more holistic picture. Unfortunately, time and resources in education and research are scarce, and we cannot afford to have in-depth focus groups with students every time we want to find out about their self-regulatory processes. So, in order to gain more insight into appropriate ways of measuring self-regulated learning, we conducted a literature review, in which we compared traditional self-report questionnaires with more behavioral measures of self-regulation, such as trace data, eye tracking measures, or think aloud protocols. The research questions for this study were as follows. So how do these offline self-report questionnaires compare to online forms of measurement in terms of calibration of student self-report of strategy use versus their actual strategy use? And does this degree of calibration vary as a function of the granularity at which self-regulated learning is measured? And calibration here means the degree of overlap between students' self-report of strategies versus the use of strategies that are measured by these more behavioral measures. We searched for literature published between 2000 and May 2016 in the following databases. We used these search terms and we looked for English peer-reviewed original research articles focusing on self-regulated learning in post-secondary education, where one of the requirements was that the study had to use both forms of measurements for the same question. So we could have really a comparison between the results for the different ways of measurement. This is a short summary of the amount of research articles we found. So after title screening, we started with 616 and we ended up with 14 included studies. And what we found was that the level of granularity really matters because different measures produce different results depending on the level of granularity. When you look at overall strategy use, so a low level of granularity, students are actually quite well able to self-report on their use of strategies with a large degree of overlap between their self-reports and the behavioral measurements. But when you look at specific strategy use, so a high granularity, this is much lower. And one of the conclusions we drew from this is that it's very important for researchers and practitioners to keep in mind the problem or the research question that they want to address, and then decide which different types of measures they will use or combine, but always use the question or the problem as a starting point. So, going back to my thread through the research project, Our final interest was to see whether we could develop interventions to increase self-regulated learning and increase self-regulated learning in students who may be less skilled in this regard. And we designed an intervention study to address this issue, starting from the hypothesis that one of the reasons that students might be using ineffective learning strategies might be because they're not really understanding what is required from them or expected from them in a problem-based curriculum. When coming to university, especially to a PBL university, a lot of emphasis is placed on students' responsibility for their own learning, while in high school they have become very accustomed to being in a teacher-centered program. So there might be a discrepancy between that, and that might cause students to fall back on strategies that they have become accustomed to rather than adapting to their new environment because they don't know what is expected in this environment. So in order to test this hypothesis, we created a workshop in which we aimed to align students' expectations and perceptions of their learning environment to those formulated by the university. And we wanted to see if this workshop would increase their self-reports of learning strategies, and also whether students with different levels of prior self-regulated learning and different levels of, I would say, realisticness of expectations would benefit in a different manner from this intervention. We used pre-test, post-test control group design, in which students were randomly allocated to either the workshop or a control condition. And we asked students to fill out questionnaires, both in the pre-test and in the post-test. One questionnaire focusing on their perceptions and expectations, the B questionnaire, and one questionnaire asking about their use of learning strategies. So although we did not find that the workshop improved students' self-reported use of learning strategies, we did find a significant increase in their intentions to take responsibility for their own learning. And that's important because it can be a first step to actually improving their behavior. We found no differential effects for different pre-test scores, so all students benefited from the intervention in the same manner. And the next step will be to find an intervention that can actually lead to this behavioral change, so go to the second step. Okay, so I'm nearing the end of my presentation. Like I said, I'm in the last year, the beginning of the last year. I still have 11 months to go. And we're currently working on a longitudinal study looking at the effects of the curriculum reform in the biomedical sciences bachelor program on the students' experiences. And data collection for this will take place until June next year. So I don't have a lot to say about that at this point, but hopefully in a few months. And then I hope to finish my PhD somewhere at the end of next year or the beginning of the year after. For now, this concludes my presentation on the studies conducted so far. I'd like to thank my supervisors, Jeroen van Mellieboer, Aniek de Bruin, and Hans Savelberg, and also my co-authors. And I'd like to open the floor for questions.